At 94, Clint Eastwood finally breaks his silence, lifting the veil on a mystery surrounding Gene Hackman for over half a century, his friend, his rival, and the most lingering presence in his life. Each word Clint speaks slices through the past like a dull knife, resurfacing missed calls, unspoken tensions, and near brawls behind the scenes of Unforgiven. Some truths about Gene Hackman, if never revealed, would follow Clint to the grave. What is that truth? This is a story of friendship and tragedy, of cowboys too proud to yield, Clint and Gene, forever staring each other down, even to the end. Clint Eastwood sat in quiet reflection by the living room window, his withered hand resting on the arm of a worn wooden chair. The fading light cast long shadows, tinting the dust-covered photos on the wall with a soft orange glow. At 94, time felt fragile, like thin paper ready to be torn by the winds of memory. But today, there was no scent of gunpowder, no rustle of a new script, only silence. And that silence carried a name, Gene Hackman. Clint had always lived with silence as an old companion. Those who knew him understood, he wasn't one to dwell on the past. But this silence was different. It was as heavy as the click of an empty gun, as final as a last hoofbeat on dry earth. Because the man now gone was Little Bill Daggett. Clint and Gene were never the kind of friends who called daily or met for drinks. They were men of a different time, communicating through glances, nods, and brief exchanges between takes. Unforgiven wasn't just an Oscar-winning film, it was a bond that tied two Western souls together. Hollywood had seen many colleagues turn to rivals, but Clint and Gene never let awards or the spotlight weaken their respect for each other. When Unforgiven premiered in 1992, both men were 62, veterans stepping out of a golden era to tell a story of aging gunslingers who had survived too much. "It's a hell of a thing, killing a man," William Money's words rang like a bell, haunting those who had worn the cowboy hat in real life. From that moment, Clint and Gene understood, some bonds are unbreakable. But time spares no legends. Clint kept working, while Gene quietly disappeared, no farewell, no retirement speech. The once relentless Popeye Doyle simply faded from Hollywood's radar. Clint called a few times, then stopped. He understood. Some old gunslingers ride into the sunset alone. Whenever Gene's name came up, Clint's eyes darkened. He was one of the best, he would say before falling silent. No one knew what passed between them in their last conversation. But whenever Unforgiven was mentioned, Clint would retreat, sit with his old guitar, and play a few quiet notes. When asked if he kept in touch with Gene, he only offered a faint smile. "We had our time." But what was the truth? No one knew. Neither man was one to share. They belonged to an era when things were settled with guns and silence. Yet, Gene's passing, shrouded in mystery, forced Clint to break that unspoken rule. When the news spread, Clint was in the middle of a documentary on the American West. He halted production, canceled his schedule, and disappeared for a week. Friends said he secluded himself in his cabin in Carmel, the same place where he and Gene had once shared whiskey on a winter afternoon in 1993. No one knew his thoughts, only that when he returned, his face bore deeper lines. Then, when the world expected him to remain silent, Clint spoke. No fanfare, no press conference, just a brief audio message sent to the LA Times. "Gene Hackman was my friend. We didn't always agree, but we respected each other. There's a code, you know. In the West, and in life. You ride with someone long enough, you don't leave them behind. I never left Gene behind. I hope he knew that." A single message, like a shot fired into the twilight. Those who had grown up with Clint and Gene understood, beneath their tough exteriors, their bond was forged in steel. When legends outlive their myths, all they have left is each other. That phrase once hung in Gene's house. No one knew if he believed it, but Clint did. And that's why, no matter how time erodes memory or how Hollywood forgets the echoes of gunfire, Clint would always carry Gene with him, like an old gunslinger keeping his last revolver in its holster. They weren't just co-stars. Not just colleagues. They were the last souls of an era now gone. And when one fell, the other had to speak to make sure their legend endured. Clint Eastwood had spoken. And now, the story truly begins. In 2015, a letter with no return address arrived at Clint Eastwood's Carmel home. Just 3 shaky letters in the corner. G.H. Dina, his ex-wife, found it in the old wooden mailbox. She placed it on his desk, beside a pile of dusty scripts, and left without a word. She knew this letter mattered more than any $1 million screenplay because it was from Gene Hackman, the old friend who lingered in Clint's mind long after the studio lights had dimmed. Inside was a yellowed sheet of paper, the handwriting unsteady but still sharp like a man who had once gripped countless golden statuettes. No greeting, no preamble. Gene got straight to the point, as always. One last ride, Clint, just you and me, no Oscars, no press, no agents, just us and a story only we can tell. Clint read the letter until the edges curled with age, but he never replied, not because he didn't want to, but because some journeys are meant to be imagined, not taken. Their story didn't start with Unforgiven. They first met in the 70s, Clint trying to step out from Dirty Harry's shadow, Gene fresh off an Oscar win for The French Connection. A brief encounter at a producer's party. Clint stood in the corner, whiskey in hand, while Gene laughed loudly, eyes flashing with the confidence of a man at his peak. One was quiet as a holstered gun, the other, a lit fuse. Then, in 1992, Unforgiven brought them together. No grand gestures, just 2 aging cowboys sharing a last cigarette before sundown. Clint never forgot Gene's expression in the final scene, when William Money turned and walked into the rain. No acting, no dialogue, just the quiet understanding of a man who knew his time was fading. An invisible thread connected them from that moment on. After Unforgiven, they rarely met. Calls became infrequent. But the letters never stopped. Gene refused to use email. Clint disliked texting. To them, handwritten words carried weight, jokes about Hollywood's decline, memories of filming in the cold, confessions only fit for paper. Do you ever wonder what it would be like if we did one more? Gene had written that once. Clint read it, folded it, and walked outside to light a cigar. He didn't reply. Not because he lacked an answer, but because the question itself was enough. They both knew Unforgiven cast too long a shadow. Anything else would be a mere echo. But in 2015, Gene asked again. This time, no subtlety. There's a story we haven't told, Clint. The story of 2 men who should have died long ago but somehow kept writing. Let's tell it before it's too late. Clint held that letter for a long time. In his mind, he saw it, the 2 of them, old and weary, standing on a dusty street. No guns, just unspoken words. But he knew Gene wasn't just asking for a film. He was asking for one last ride, 2 old souls who had weathered every storm. A movie could fail. A friendship wouldn't. Yet Clint said no. Not in words, not by phone. Just silence, like William Money before a gunfight. Not because he didn't want to, but because he feared the legends would crumble. That when they stood together again, they wouldn't be cowboys, just old men, frail under the spotlight. And Gene deserved more than that. Gene understood. He never wrote again. But in 2019, sensing his time was short, he sent Clint a final gift, an old leather-bound notebook. Inside, just one line. We had our ride, partner. That's all that matters. Clint kept that notebook close in the years that followed. Each time he opened it, he saw Gene's silhouette fading through an old wooden door. No need for another film, another project. Their story had already been told in quiet moments, in unspoken bonds, in the letters that never needed a reply. When news of Gene's passing broke, Clint didn't cry. He simply opened the notebook, sat on the porch, and whispered, "See you at the next town, partner." Because old cowboys don't say goodbye. They just ride on, leaving behind untold legends. In 2018, at a small seaside bar in Carmel, California, Clint Eastwood sat across from his longtime agent, a thick stack of scripts in front of him. These weren't the usual Hollywood pitches. This was different. This came from Gene Hackman. A few months earlier, Gene had called, his voice deeper, slower, stripped of the booming laughter Clint once knew. "Clint, I've got something, maybe my last. I don't know how much time I have left, but if there's one last film, I only want to do it with you." Clint had stayed silent for a long time. When old gunslingers talk about their last stand, it means the gun is loaded. The only question is where the bullet will land. The film had no title, no producers, no contract, just a crumpled sheet of paper. Two old cowboys, once brothers in arms, now on opposite ends of town. A gunfight no one wants, but cannot avoid. Clint liked it. Gene liked it too. But that was the last thing they agreed on. Clint wanted nostalgia, a quiet farewell. Gene wanted something raw, something that stripped away the myths they had built. The letters that once bound them became battlegrounds. Gene accused Clint of fearing his own legend. Clint mocked Gene for chasing relevance in a world that had moved on. By late 2018, they met one last time in Santa Fe. No assistants. No producers. Just two men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder, now sitting across from each other in a dimly lit room. No one knows what was said, but a hotel worker later recalled. Gene left first. He slammed the door so hard the picture on the wall shook. Clint just sat there, staring at his whiskey. He never took a sip. The film died that day. No announcement. No explanation. Just silence, stretching across years. Then, in 2021, at the height of the pandemic, the phone rang. Gene. Their first call in over 2 years. No one knew who dialed first, but they both understood it might be the last. They talked about the weather. About gas prices. About old movies neither had watched in years. But neither spoke of the film. Then, after a long pause, Gene's voice softened. "Clint, do you remember the last scene of Unforgiven? When I stood there, watching you ride away in the rain?" Clint said nothing. Gene chuckled. "I never said this, but I knew then. I knew we'd never have another time." The call ended with a sigh on both ends. They didn't hang up immediately. Just sat there, listening to each other breathe, two old cowboys, hands on their holsters, but neither drawing. Afterward, Clint told a friend, "I don't think I'll talk to Gene again." And he was right. When news of Gene's passing broke in 2023, Clint made no statement, no tribute. He just retreated to his ranch and opened the drawer where he kept Gene's letters spanning decades. He read them all, searching for something unspoken, some hidden truth between the lines. He found nothing. Just the gaps. The crossed-out words. The unsent letters. Because Gene Hackman's greatest secret wasn't in what he wrote. It was in the silence between them. A bullet never fired. A story never finished. A ride that had already ended, long before either of them had realized. The news of Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, being found dead in their small Santa Fe home didn't shock Clint Eastwood. At 94, he was no stranger to quiet departures in the night. What kept him standing motionless by the window of his Carmel ranch that morning wasn't Gene's passing, but the realization that the words that should have been spoken would now remain forever unsaid. The press swarmed immediately, searching for a statement from Clint. For 2 years, he and Gene had been like ghosts, never meeting, never mentioning each other, not even a text. Since their last phone call in 2021, when silence filled more space than words, every bridge between them had collapsed. But that afternoon, Clint broke his silence. Not through a manager, not with a sterile press release. He stood in front of a local newspaper's camera himself, his voice rough with age and years of self-imposed quiet. There was no finer actor than Gene Hackman. And no friend more important to me than him. Just 2 sentences, plain, unembellished. But those who had followed these two old cowboys for decades understood, Clint Eastwood had never said such things about anyone. Not about Sergio Leone, not about Lee Van Cleef, not even about his first wife. Only about Gene Hackman. The journalists assumed that was the end of it. But it wasn't. After that brief statement, Clint drove back to his ranch, shut the doors, and cut off all communication. Landline, cell phone, even his old fax machine, all fell silent, like a deserted town after a gunfight. Only one call was made. The recipient was Kyle Eastwood, Clint's eldest son, the one who understood better than anyone the strange yet unshakable bond between his father and Gene Hackman. According to Kyle, Clint's voice that day was different, softer, yet heavier. The steel-hard tone of the man with no name was gone, replaced by the voice of an old man finally conceding he had lost a battle with himself. "We wasted too much time being stubborn old bastards." One sentence. No excuses, no justifications. But within it lay regret, self-awareness, and a quiet kind of love. Gene Hackman wasn't just a co-star, wasn't just a comrade in cinematic battles. He was the only mirror that reflected a raw, flawed, and vulnerable Clint Eastwood behind the cold cowboy facade. And Clint knew he was the only mirror Gene Hackman had ever dared to look into. For nearly 50 years, the two had done everything except admit how much they needed each other. They exchanged letters, told stories, dreamed about projects that never happened. They argued, slammed phones down, drank for no reason at all. But they never said out loud that, in the end, the real pain wouldn't come from losing a friend, but from pushing that friend too far away to ever come back. And so, when the dust settled, Clint sat alone on his porch, gazing out at the Pacific. No cigarette, no whiskey, just the wind whistling through the old wooden planks. Those close to him knew Clint Eastwood was not a man who cried easily. But that day, Kyle said, his eyes were red. Some tears don't fall, they sink inward, quietly wearing away the hardest edges of a cowboy's soul. Clint had survived hundreds of gunfights on screen, but this final battle, with his own stubbornness, was his most bitter defeat. The press kept digging, speculating. Was there a joint will between Clint and Gene? A secret agreement about the unfinished film from 2018? A final letter Clint never sent? No one knew, except Clint. And he wasn't telling. All the world saw was a frail old man sitting at his dining table, idly turning an old lighter in his hands, a birthday gift from Gene in 1985, after Pale Rider was released. Engraved on it were just two words, compadre. Not friend, not brother. Just compadre, a companion, a gunslinger who would stand by your side but was always ready to draw if needed. As twilight fell over the Carmel Ranch, Clint's shadow stretched across the wooden floor, blending with the sound of the waves. Life moved on, as it always did. But somewhere in that fading light, perhaps Gene Hackman still stood, squinting at his old friend, just as they had once stood on opposite ends of a town. No greetings, no gunfire. Just two old souls, finally learning to let go. Chapter 5: Ghost Riders in the Sky. The news of Gene Hackman and his wife passing away together on a quiet afternoon in Santa Fe swept through Hollywood like a cold wind. No spectacle, no grand farewell, just as he had lived for the past 20 years. But when that wind settled, it left behind a vast emptiness, not just in cinema history, but in the hearts of those who had once stood alongside Gene under the lights. Hollywood woke up to the quiet realization that a legend had slipped away unnoticed. Tributes poured in like a steady night rain, soft but unrelenting. From young actors who had never met him to veterans who had measured themselves against his craft, each shared their own words for the gruff yet masterful cowboy. Morgan Freeman, who had stood beside him in Unforgiven, posted a black and white photo from 1992, three men sitting on a wooden porch, cigarettes in hand, gazing into the distance. Clint, Gene, and Morgan. Gene was the only man who could make Clint Eastwood lose his patience on set, but Clint was also the only one who could make Gene Hackman crack up at a dry joke. They were like oil and water, and yet they couldn't do without each other. But the words the world truly waited for were Clint Eastwood's. Clint didn't say much. He sent just one handwritten letter, delivered through his manager to The Hollywood Reporter. Short, direct, but carrying the weight of 5 decades of rivalry, respect, and unspoken understanding. Gene Hackman and I were never close friends, at least not by Hollywood's definition. We didn't text every week. We didn't show up at each other's birthdays. We argued more than we laughed. We sat in silence more than we spoke. But if someone asked me, at the other end of my gun, who I'd want to see, it was always Gene Hackman. 4 sentences. Nothing more. And yet, Hollywood fell silent. To the film industry, that was no ordinary farewell, it was a vow. Because if Clint Eastwood was the last surviving cowboy of Hollywood's golden age, then Gene Hackman was the only man who had ever stood as his equal, unshaken, unafraid. Not a rival, not exactly an ally, but the only one Clint would have considered worthy of a final showdown. The stories of Unforgiven resurfaced. That brutal, unsentimental Western where Clint and Gene faced off on screen and clashed just as fiercely behind the scenes. The press revisited tales from the set like the time Gene erupted when Clint changed the line without warning, or when Clint walked out of a meeting after Gene hit a nerve with a comment about his directing. But they always came back, Richard Harris had once said. Like 2 lost cowboys, no matter how much they cursed each other, they knew they only had each other. Old photos flooded social media. Clint and Gene, standing side by side in the cold Alberta rain, coats heavy with dust, eyes narrowed against the wind. No smiles, no forced poses, just 2 men standing there, as if the only thing that mattered was the presence of the other. Hollywood loves its grand, polished friendships. But the story of Clint and Gene was never that. No sentimental speeches, no heartfelt toasts over whiskey. Just stubborn handshakes after each fight, terse letters filled with 1,000 unspoken words. And maybe that raw, unpolished bond was why Hollywood respected them more than any scripted brotherhood. We don't have to like each other to know we need each other. Clint's old quote from 2004 resurfaced, shared across film forums. Gene Hackman was gone, taking his untold stories with him. And Clint Eastwood remained, a lone gunslinger standing at the edge of an empty horizon. No one left at the other end of the gun to push back, to argue over every detail, to sit beside him in silence after a long day of filming. No one had ever understood Clint Eastwood the way Gene Hackman did. Hollywood remembered Gene Hackman as a legend of cinema. But to Clint, he wasn't some untouchable icon, just the only man who dared to call him stubborn and then laugh. The only one who could throw a script in his face, then pick it up, rewrite it, and say, "Do it right." And somewhere, under the dim glow of a roadside bar, maybe in the vast Hollywood night sky, 2 cowboy ghosts rode once more along a dusty trail. Saying nothing. Needing to say nothing. Just 2 old men, finally riding together just as it should have been. January 2024. As winter draped Carmel by the sea in white, Clint Eastwood sat by the window at an old wooden table, his calloused fingers wrapped around a fountain pen that had been with him for decades. A blank sheet of paper lay before him, silent, expectant, as if waiting for a final confession. Clint had never been one for apologies, let alone explanations. His handwriting was slow, unsteady, as if every letter carried the weight of the years behind him. The letter was for Gene Hackman, his friend, his rival, the one man Clint had spent a lifetime both avoiding and missing. Gene. I guess we both thought we had more time. Turns out, all we really had was Unforgiven. The words were sparse, direct, like Clint himself. But beneath those simple inked lines lay decades of history. Fights over the smallest details, long stretches of silence, shared glances that spoke more than either ever would aloud. Clint folded the letter and slid it into a worn brown envelope. But he never sent it. It remained tucked away in an old wooden box in the corner of the room, alongside unfinished scripts, faded set photos, and memories of Gene that had never been spoken aloud. That box was Clint's quiet archive, a place where everything left unsaid found its resting place. When his family discovered it, after Gene Hackman and his wife had passed, the letter was still there, untouched, never mailed, never needing to be. Because the man it was meant for had already understood. Some friendships don't need a perfect ending. Some apologies don't need to be spoken. And some cowboys are meant to stand at opposite ends of a town, neither stepping forward nor turning away, just waiting in the fading light. That evening, Clint sat on his porch, watching the sky burn with the last colors of the day. His shadow stretched long across the wooden planks, a lone gunslinger who had finally realized that all the grudges, all the pride, all the stubbornness between him and Jean, none of it had ever really mattered. Because in the end, all that remained was the wind, carrying the distant echo of hoofbeats, where two old cowboys finally rode side by side, on a road no longer divided. The letter stayed in the box, a final secret between them. And Clint Eastwood, the last cowboy, murmured into the darkness, "I'll see you, Jean, when the dust settles." Two last cowboys, one fallen, one standing alone in the final wind of the Old West. No winners, no losers. Just unspoken words, unsent letters, and rusty guns lying still under the dust of time.